All right, this is your favorite principle here with your reading, Unit 6B, the Great Depression. The modern era has seen an increase in global, why are you laughing at me? Interdependence, culturally, economically, and politically since 1920. The advent of technology has fueled interconnectedness of the world.
Do you remember the 1920s, Mr. Gray?
That's a big word. The Depression of the 1930s, when I was born, most commonly referred to as the Great Depression, was not limited to the United States. It was a worldwide situation. Serious economic problems developed in Europe due to severe damages caused by World War I and the heavy monetary penalties, reparations, imposed on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles. And I'm German.
You messed up on an easy word.
I know. Many European nations were faced with the expense of having to rebuild for the war. And although the Allied nations were using the reparations from Germany to help rebuild, the expenses due to the extreme damages of the war were high. Nations also faced the transition of soldiers returning from the war looking for work or replacing workers who held their jobs during the wartime. Wartime spending had stretched many nations financially, but had also kept unemployment high due to jobs created to maintain their militaries. Because of these factors, unemployment, joblessness, rose in many nations after war. Your second favorite social studies teacher will take over at this time.
Who's their favorite social studies teacher?
Mr. Lewis.
They don't like when he reads it. They like me better. So to start, you can see the chart where you can see the unemployment in the US and what it was estimated to be and then what it actually was. And you notice the 1930s to 1940s is the highlighted area. So the Great Depression in Europe. Germany faced the greatest economic challenges due to the high reparations and the loss of some of its prime industrial land and resources imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. While this seemed to support British and French goals to prohibit and prevent Germany from causing another worldwide war, German economic weakness actually hurt trade and production in Western Europe. So why did Germany face the greatest economic challenges? It is because of the high reparations, which basically means they owed a lot of people a lot of money, and they also lost industrial land. So they had to give back a lot of land that their factories were on. And then in 1923, France further hurt Germany's economically by seizing the Ruhr Valley, Germany's main industrial region. Germany's response was to begin printing money that had no economic support, thereby causing hyperinflation and devaluing of money across the continent. Due to all of these financial difficulties and the necessities to rebuild, European nations were not buying and investing in foreign goods, including the goods from the United States. This was a negative impact on all involved. So, what is hyperinflation, Mr. Gray? Apparently, he doesn't know. What's hyperinflation? It's when you begin to devalue money. Mr. Gray apologizes for being distracting. So it's when you devalue money. And then European nations. Go away, Mr. Gray. I'm not starting this over. They were not buying and investing in foreign goods. So they were not. He finally left us alone. So now we're going to talk about the Great Depression in the United States, which I believe some of you have already studied. So despite the economic problems in Europe, the economy of the United States experienced an artificial boom in the 1920s. It appeared that in the U.S. economy was thriving. However, this could not last. American companies continued producing goods at high volumes that they had achieved during wartime, expecting beneficial trade to continue. American farmers who had fed the Allied armies and the people of Europe throughout the war no longer had the European market and were unable to make a profit throughout the 1920s. The wages of industrial workers remained low. For a while, a while, many Americans were able to buy goods on the installment plan, which meant they were buying goods on credit. But by the end of the decade, American consumers were reaching the extent of their buying power. The 1920s seemed like a boom because many Americans increasingly bought more stock, shared ownership in the United States companies. Hoping Mr. Gray is so immature. I don't remember where we are. For a while, many Americans were able to buy goods on the installment plan, buying goods on a credit. But by the end of the decade, American consumers were reaching the extent of their buying power. The 1920s seemed like a boom time because many Americans increasingly bought more stock, which is shared ownership in a company, in the United States. Hoping that the good times would continue, these stocks were often bought on margin, which is buying stocks on credit. And the investments were risky because they relied on business growth. This increase in buying stock on a margin led to stocks values rising quickly and making it appear as though money could be easily and quickly made. This enticed more investors into risky stock market. The sales of goods slowed because European consumers could not buy and American consumers slowed their purchases. Companies began experiencing a surplus of goods with an ever shrinking customer market. As the surplus rapidly increased, investors began to sell their stock, causing stock prices to quickly decline in the late 1920s. So a lot of you guys talked about the roaring 20s, and those were the great times. Well, that's when the stock market was up, people were buying things on credit, like life was great. And then all of a sudden, near the end of the 1920s is when we see the Great Depression. So why were so many Americans investing in the stock market during the 1920s? One, because they could. And another big part of it was this investment plan. So even if I didn't have the money, I could buy it on credit. And so then we have this idea that things were bought on a margin, which again is buying on credit. So I might not have the money, but I want to have the money. So I'm going to buy some stock in it. Hopefully my stock will go up. The value of my stock will go up. I can sell it. I can trade it. I can get more of it, which will make me a lot of money quickly. Well, that works when the company is growing. What we're going to see is companies quit growing. So here is where it says creditors began demanding payments for stocks bought on margin. So those were the stocks that were bought on credit, but investors had no money to make repayments. Many investors quickly tried to sell their stocks and withdrew their money from the banks to meet their financial obligations. All of these activities resulted in a stock market crash. So what caused the stock market to crash? These creditors began asking for payments on their stocks that were bought at margin, but the investors had no money. And then we have people who are trying to make a quick buck, I guess you would say. And so they're trying to sell their stock to make a little bit of money just to pay back the money that they owe from when they originally bought their stock. And then we have on October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday. The United States stock market experienced the biggest loss in financial worth. As a result of losses in the stock market and declining consumer demand, companies laid off workers and unemployment rose. The demand for goods continued to decrease, the increasing problem of surplus goods. So it is when Black Friday is when the United States stock market experienced the biggest loss in financial worth. Quizzes. So then, a little more economic talk. The cycle escalated as layoffs increased, sales decreased, and more people went to the banks to withdraw all of their money. These runs of the bank affected people nationwide. Even depositors who had not invested in the stock market had their savings wiped out in a panic to retrieve funds. The banks had loaned so much money of their capital, and neither the deposits nor the loans were protected by the bank insurance at this time. At the same time, people were losing their savings. Banks demanded full refunds on their loans. This is called, or known as, the calling the loan. Banks did this in order to reinstate their capital and prevent closure. Citizens with mortgages, which are home loans, and other loans began losing their homes and other possessions. Unemployment and homelessness continued to increase. Banks and businesses closed, and the economic depression in the United States made the worldwide depression worse. So, how did the economic depression in America make the worldwide depression worse? The United States itself was making a lot of money. After World War I, we looked like great guys. So then when we ended the war or helped to end the war, we came home, our businesses were booming, life was good, and then all of a sudden the stock market crashes and banks are asking for their money back. People who borrowed money did not have the money to repay them. So when you see banks shutting down, businesses shutting down, people losing their jobs, in a nation that just helped win World War I, people started to lose hope. And we weren't helping financially other countries because we were hardly helping ourselves. So, how did countries respond to the Great Depression? Nations responded differently to the economic struggle. The reaction of most nations was to turn inward into a policy of isolationism by focusing on solving their own nation's economic problems. In democratic nations, the governments work to improve economic conditions through the passage of laws. Some nations turn to totalitarianism, which is unlimited governments. In nations that turn to totalitarianism, leaders use their power to begin imperializing to gain raw materials and markets to help stimulate their economies. This will eventually lead to World War II. So, the American response to, let's fix that, the Great Depression. So, overwhelmingly, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected to replace Herbert Hoover in 1932 as President of the United States. Roosevelt proposed, the Congress approved, programs that together began known as the New Deal. It focused on relief and reform in the form of public work programs to increase employment, as well as regulations or rules on the stock market, banks and businesses, and agricultural production. Enhance the national government's role in the economy and in the lives of individuals. For the first time in American history, direct relief as provided by the government was a significant component to everyday life. So down here, what I'd like you to do is create a little advertisement for the New Deal. So the New Deal was about giving relief and reform to the American people. It was supposed to help people want to find jobs, feel safe about finding a job, want to invest in the stock market again, because now there are rules for the stock market, there's rules for the bank, there's businesses that have to follow a certain code of laws so that this Great Depression will never happen again. They also started to really regulate the agricultural production. So, this relief program was supposed to help every person in some way, shape, or form in their everyday life. It's the first time we really see the government take a role like that. So, you're just going to draw a little picture of the New Deal or write the New Deal and write some of the great things that it did or was supposed to do. And then we're going to talk about what was happening in Britain. Britain, on the other hand, enacted protectionist policies that were designed to protect the domestic industries and services from foreign competition, such as dropping the gold standard and increased government ownership and or management of the key industries. Britain also raised taxes to loan money to new businesses in hopes of increasing employment. So how did Great Britain respond? They enacted this protectionist policy, which was supposed to help increase government ownership and management of key industries. They also raised taxes to loan money to new businesses and hopefully created new jobs. And then we get the German response. So the Depression provided the opportunity for radical groups to get involved in the government. Germany saw rise in the Nazi Party. Adolf Hitler was able to take advantage of the economic anxiety and political discontent or dissatisfaction and the parliamentary structure of the government to become the government chancellor in 1933. He took advantage of the bad economic conditions and people's anxiety and fear to eliminate political opponents, consolidate political power, and ultimately establish totalitarian, total control of the government. The German hatred of the Treaty of Versailles, coupled with Hitler's repeated renunification or defiance of the treaty, greatly increased his popularity and advanced his political career. So, how was Hitler able to gain power? This paragraph right here. Right here. So, he took advantage of the bad economic times, people's anxiety and fears, and he eliminated his political opponents. And ultimately, he consolidates political power, just means that he got everyone to believe or follow in one thing. And he eventually establishes this totalitarian control. He takes total control over the government. And the very last thing we have to do is what was happening elsewhere in the world. Similarly, the economic depression allowed Benito Mussolini to gain support in Italy and allowed for a military takeover of Japan. The totalitarian governments of Germany, Italy, and Japan would use the economic depression to justify the takeover of other nations in order to help improve their own economies. So, what I want you to do right here is to stop and think about the three sentences, three main ideas that you think sum up the Great Depression. I think if you go all the way to the top, you can kind of think about what was happening in kind of the end of World War I. So think about the economy that happened. Think about what Mr. Gray talked about, unemployment. People at the end of the war thought that life would keep rolling through, making a lot of goods, buying them, selling them, jobs. All of a sudden, World War I is over, and that's not exactly how the economy was left. Then you think about the United States, the stock market crashing, people buying things on credit, not having the money. Then all of a sudden, businesses don't grow, banks want their money, businesses need money, people are out of money, they've spent money they don't have. Then you think about Black Tuesday, the United States, the role, how they tried to fix it, how it didn't necessarily go as planned. Then you have the Great Depression, where nations have realized this crisis they're in. So a lot of them went into isolationism. So they focused on trying to fix their problems, and each one fixed it a different way. The United States did the New Deal. Britain did this protectionist policy where they tried to just protect their businesses that they had. Germany had the Nazi Party and totalitarian control. And then we have other countries like Germany, Italy, and Japan that also used totalitarianism to justify the takeover. Ethan's not happy about that over there. So, three things that you think summarize the Great Depression.